Alright, so I just finished filming this video already, but the file got corrupted, so I'm gonna do it again. Try to make it quick, try to make it very, straightforward. But anyways, I think a lot of us know about the importance of dopamine. A lot of us know about the importance of genes and, how genes manifest in our, life today. You can have genes for eyebrows, eye color, hair, skin color, whatever, obviously. But then there's also the genes that affect your mind and the way that you go about life and your actions and behaviors. And so, obviously there's going to be some genes that make people that are more prone to addiction. There are going to be genes that make people more prone to, traveling, promiscuity, whatever the case may be. So today I want to talk about this class of genes called the DRD1 to 5, stands for dopamine receptor, D1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Really going to mainly highlight DRD2 and DRD4. What the implications of these are, what, variations in these genes, how they manifest in your life today. Have some notes here going to be reading off. So, yeah. So, let's first talk about DRD2. I think this is going to be one of the more important ones. And basically, DRD2, with the TAC1A allele, this just basically means that there are less D2 receptors. So that means there's less dopamine receptors in the brain, or D2, and so this makes it so that people that, when you get reward from doing difficult tasks or from completing a project, you should get a healthy level of dopamine that rewards you for doing that, right? But with people with this allele, with this variation, it's like they barely get any reward for doing anything, right? So let's say they were to study or to take a test. Usually you get some level of dopamine that rewards you for doing that. But with the DRD2 allele or gene that has a variation, it's mutated, people that do hard tasks, as I said, will have reward deficiency syndrome. So yeah, you just won't get rewarded for, it's going to be harder to naturally create dopamine, like through healthy habits. And so this is what leads people a lot of times to seeking out substances, or, eating or doing out like external things to increase the dopamine that you have. So, for example, substance abuse is a huge problem with people with a mutated DRD2 gene because there's a baseline level of dopamine that's important to have so that you feel pleasure and you can like move on with your daily life and like do things. With people with this gene, that baseline level is significantly lower, and the brain just does not give you that dopamine for doing things, that are healthy. So this is why people can sometimes rely on substances, alcohol, drugs, things that will give them that fake dopamine and ultimately to feel whole, to feel that reward. So this is a very slippery slope. Obviously, you don't want to get into substances. This is why getting, medicated and, getting psychiatric medication and help is very important. We'll talk about ADHD in the near future as well. So we'll mention what that has to do with all of this. And yeah, next I want to talk about the DRD4 gene. People call this the explorer gene. I discovered this when I was taking an MCAT practice test. Showed up as a passage, and I just thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I started doing research after the exam. So, yeah. When I took the exam, did not really mention anything about it being the explorer gene, but we'll talk about that in a second. So, with the DRD4 gene, when there is the 7R repeat allele, this basically means that the receptor is not as efficient. So the signaling is a lot more sluggish, and so this drives people to crave more external stimulation. And this is what leads people to novelty seeking, risk taking. This is usually associated with promiscuity as well, sexual promiscuity. This is what leads people to behavioral addictions. People can get addicted to pornography, gambling, sex, whatever. Things like that. Risky things, people that street race or whatever, people that do crazy, very high risk stuff. So this is what is associated with DRD4. Basically, if if you feel like you can't just sit still and do something, this is a big part of it. And yeah, ADHD is, huge when it comes to all this. ADHD is basically brain does not provide that much dopamine from, when you're sitting down and studying. So it's hard to lock in on something when you're not getting rewarded for it. So it drives people to go and, scroll on Instagram Reels, whatever. And these genes were important at some point, back in the day, when our ancestors were living in huts, there was one watch guy while everyone was sleeping to make sure that bears wouldn't come and eat them or whatever. That person had an evolutionary advantage to be able to have their mind aware of multiple things around them to keep them alive. So this is why we've evolved into it. But nowadays, when you're just sitting down trying to take an 8-hour exam, that's just not going to help. So although I will say that people with ADHD a lot of times can be very successful in business, and they are. Oftentimes people that are CEOs and super successful, they do have ADHD. You learn how to channel it, how to use it for your benefit. So talked about DRD2, we talked about DRD4. DRD3 has to do with emotions. Basically, it has to do with anxiety, craving, anxiety about a reward, craving a reward. A lot of times people that have this will be very susceptible to relapsing if they're addicted to drugs. So it has to do with that craving, All in all, dopamine is super important for motivation, super important for drive. When there is a gene that stops people from, naturally producing it or getting the dopamine that they need from, healthy things, this is what drives people to seek out substances, seek out sex, seek out things that will give that massive hit of dopamine. But in the end, all these things leave someone feeling depleted. So it's really bad that someone has a low baseline, because it makes it hard to do a lot of things, right? This is why some people can get susceptible to just sitting and scrolling for hours. I think people a lot of the time will say that ADHD has to do with, it's not everyone has it, but everyone's getting diagnosed with it because of all this short form content, TikTok, social media. That might have something to do with it, but it could also be a correlation thing, that these people just are not getting that natural dopamine release from difficult subjects, from sitting down and studying and locking in on something. So they go to Instagram Reels, they go to TikTok. We're not going to really talk about DRD5, but DRD1 has to do with executive function. Executive function is pretty important, if you want to get started on stuff, if you want to complete tasks, stuff like that. Emotional regulation, stuff that has to do with the prefrontal cortex. That is what executive function and the DRD1 gene have to do with each other. Don't know too much about it. I'm not going to go much in depth into it. Basically, if you feel like you don't really get that reward, that dopamine hit from doing difficult stuff like people usually do, like from studying or completing projects or, doing business, whatever people do for dopamine hits, that could be a sign of DRD2. It's reward deficiency syndrome, as I said before. When you're supposed to get a reward from doing something, there's a deficiency in that pathway that stops people from getting that reward. It's a little different because with DRD4, dopamine will still hit the receptor, but it won't do what it needs to do. It won't give that feeling of satisfaction and pleasure. And this leads people to novelty seeking, to risk taking, to traveling and exploring and adventuring and sexual promiscuity, whatever. So yeah, A lot of these have to do with ADHD as well, as I mentioned. This is why it's very important to get professional help if you suspect that you have ADHD. I think I'm a big advocate that, early diagnosis of ADHD prevents addiction and things like that, because if someone is diagnosed with ADHD, they're getting medicated, whether it's stimulants, these good psychiatric medications and treatments are super helpful because it will give the brain the dopamine it needs so you can do what you need to do, so you can study, so you can work. And it also kills the craving for substances, alcohol, drugs, because then you don't need that dopamine from external things because you're getting it from a controlled psychiatric treatment. I'm not advocating for getting stimulants or anything like that. In a shady way. Definitely go find a doctor, find a psychiatrist, find a therapist, and use therapy with your psychiatrist treatments to really manage these symptoms. And yeah, it's really important. Just be mindful. If you suspect that you might have one of these genes, just be aware of it so you know how to navigate, what your strengths and weaknesses are, so you can stop yourself from getting hooked on things like gambling or anything. And so that you can just know what you need to do to live healthy. So yeah, that's all I have to say for today. If you learned something, let me know if this was helpful. If there are any other questions or any other topics I should talk about, I just have found a lot of interest in this. I just want to talk about it a little bit. But yeah, let me know. And if I think of anything else, I'll let you know as well. So take care. Hope you guys enjoyed.